Madam President, we are seeing all the ingredients for a military, humanitarian, and economic storm breaking on an already devastated Syria, with dangerous and unpredictable consequences for civilians and international peace and security. I have 5 urgent appeals in this regard. First, Syria must be sheltered from regional conflict. I repeat my call for the respect of the sovereignty, unity, independence, and territorial integrity of Syria. Syria cannot become a free-for-all venue where different actors settle their scores or fuel other theaters, nor a staging ground for attacks or retaliation. Second, regional tensions must be de-escalated now. I echo the Secretary General's call for immediate ceasefires in Gaza and Lebanon. I also express grave concern at the prospect of further escalations between Israel and Iran and what this could trigger as regards to Syria. Third, there is a risk that regional escalation could unravel ceasefire agreements that have, however imperfectly, provided for a vital freeze in front lines inside Syria for almost 4 years. Further work is needed to de-escalate towards a nationwide ceasefire in line with Resolution 2254. We also need to see alongside this a cooperative approach to combating Security Council-listed terrorist groups in line with international law. Fourth, all actors, Syrian and international, including Israel, must comply with international humanitarian law, including the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution. I deplore the civilian deaths, which are rising again, and the damage to civilian infrastructure. Fifth, and finally, let me also remind of the importance of UNDOF's presence and stress the need for both parties to abide by the terms of the disengagement agreement. Violation of the agreement could increase tensions between the parties and lead to a further escalation of the situation in the region. Madam President, I recently conveyed these same messages in clear terms to members of the ceasefire task force in Geneva, including Russia, Turkey, the United States, and Iran, building on all my engagement in New York last month. Madam President, amidst this dangerous kinetic environment, UNHCR says some 425,000 people have crossed into Syria in the recent weeks, fleeing Israeli airstrikes and violence. Around 72% of these are Syrians, the remainder mostly Lebanese. It goes without saying, Syrians must be protected wherever they are, including those moving and those who have remained where they are. The world is closely watching to see whether the concerns that Syrian refugees have long themselves expressed will be meaningfully addressed in this new situation. I hope that all stakeholders understand that this is indeed a critical moment for all to act responsibly and constructively. We have always stressed that there are 2 areas of concerns that the refugees cite. One set related to protection arising from fears of arbitrary arrest, mandatory military conscription, and housing, land and property rights. And one set related to livelihoods arising from lack of basic services, healthcare, water, electricity, and inadequate housing. In this regard, let me first echo High Commissioner Grandi's appreciation for the government keeping the borders open for everybody and for simplifying some procedures, working with the UNHCR. Of course, more will be needed, on the full range of protection issues. Indeed, let me also stress, as the High Commissioner has, the need to continue over time to ensure that the safety and security of all those arriving from Lebanon, not only upon crossing, but thereafter. Let me also stress that this appeal applies to all authorities and de facto authorities. And let me in the same vein also underline the need for unimpeded access through all modalities. Second, let me also echo the UN appeal for donors to give generously. Both those who are moving and the communities into which they are entering are often facing conditions of utter misery. Emergency humanitarian aid and early recovery activities need substantial resources for recent arrivals and for the millions of Syrians who are suffering. The generosity of donors to date is appreciated, but much more will be needed. This appeal too applies to all areas of Syria. Let me also underline the need for the active engagement of sanctioning states to mitigate and avoid the adverse effects of sanctions, particularly in the form of over-compliance. Madam President, the latest developments serve as a stark reminder of Syria's deep fragility. Partial, piecemeal, or conflict management approaches alone cannot tackle the scale of the ever-mounting challenges that Syria faces. Syria remains in a state of profound conflict, with Syrians divided politically and across different areas, and under enormous stresses of so many kinds. There is obviously no quick fix for these challenges. Unless the long-stalled Syrian-owned and led political process facilitated by the United Nations resumes and begins to move forward, I fear we will continue to see Syria beset by crisis upon crisis with no end. Instead, now today would be exactly the time to de-escalate and to send a new signal to the Syrian people and the international community that the search for a political settlement is meaningfully resuming. Madam President, what could this look like? It will mean the Syrians coming together again within the Constitutional Committee, and I raised specific ideas on this during consultations with the Syrian parties here in New York last month, and I continue to pursue this. It means taking seriously the promise of genuine confidence building step for step among Syrian and international stakeholders. Beyond this, it also means developing a new and comprehensive path out of this conflict, one that tackles the Syrian-owned and led political issues at the heart of the conflict with UN facilitation and without foreign interference, as well as the sovereignty, security, civilian protection, and economic issues in which outside stakeholders are also deeply involved. We need constructive international diplomacy in support of the core of the matter, a UN-facilitated intra-Syrian process to advance Security Council Resolution 2254. Madam President, during the high-level week, I have discussed urgent de-escalations and ways of advancing the political process with the Syrian Foreign Minister and the Syrian Negotiations Commission. I also did so with Russian, Turkish, and Iranian foreign ministers meeting in the Astana format, and with Arab foreign ministers, and with senior officials from the United States and Europe and others. Madam President, one process that continues is the active work of men and women from Syrian civil society that tirelessly serve their country and their communities. I thank Switzerland for its support of our efforts to facilitate processes of inclusion, dialogue and cooperation among Syrian civil society, particularly through the Civil Society Support Room. I'm very much looking forward to listen to Abir, who will brief us a little bit later. Many of the priorities of our office are informed by the insights that they share, and it is our honor to support and work together with them. The same is true with the Women's Advisory Board, whose insights and energy we continue to rely upon, and who work together across different lines. Last week, they spoke to me from all corners of Syria and outside too, conveying the impacts of the latest crisis on their communities. Syrians are stepping up to support arrivals from Lebanon in an already economically strained environment amid fears of further military and regional escalation. Syrian women continue to identify opportunities for the political process to move forward, build trust, and give voice to the voiceless. And everywhere, Syrian women are on the front lines, bearing the burden of this conflict for their communities and families, while advocating for an end to violence. Madam President, as you know very well, in this month, when we mark the passage of 24 years since Security Council Resolution 1325, we recommit ourselves to the meaningful political participation of women in the Syrian political process. I remind the Syrian parties and all of you that sustainable peace only comes when the outcomes of a political process reflect the evolution and sacrifice of all members of society. Madam President, by concluding, let me remind you that Syrians need today the urgent protection provided by de-escalation and the support needed to face crisis upon crisis. And they need an inclusive and comprehensive political path out of the conflict and the implementation of Security Council Resolution 2254 that restores Syria's sovereignty, restores the dignity of the long-suffering Syrian people, enables them independently to shape their country's future, and contributes to stability in the region. As we seek to facilitate this path in the face of enormous challenges, we need the cooperation and engagement of the Syrian parties and all key players. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Pedersen for his briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Edem Vasorno.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, today I'd like to highlight three key issues. First, the growing impact of hostilities in the region on Syria, including the influx of arrivals from Lebanon, as Special Envoy Pedersen has just highlighted. Second, that this is adding to an immense and ongoing crisis in Syria. And of course, third, the critical need to ensure sufficient support for both emergency response and early recovery. Madam President, for months we've expressed concern about the dangers posed by the escalating conflict in the Middle East and its impact on the already dire humanitarian situation in Syria. We are now seeing these dangers unfold. Since September 23rd, more than 425,000 people have fled Lebanon into Syria. An estimated 72% are Syrians, again, you've just heard that, of whom almost 60% are children. Like the Special Envoy has said, we also welcome the government of Syria keeping the borders open for people arriving, which has eased some immigration procedures. These include the temporary lifting of the requirement for Syrian nationals to exchange $100 into currency, local currency, upon arrival until the end of October. This includes accepting alternative forms of identification in lieu of passports for all nationalities and allowing safe passage through the country, including to non-government controlled areas. We also note the government's establishment of hosting centers for Lebanese refugees in 10 governorates, instruction to offer discounted hotel rooms, and granting them access to education and health services through national institutions. As United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, noted during his recent visit to Syria, Syrians are returning to their country under the extreme duress of hostilities in Lebanon. It remains imperative that their safety security, and fundamental rights in Syria are ensured, and they must have the freedom to reach their preferred destinations. It is equally vital that the humanitarian organizations have unhindered access to those arriving and to all people in need. The United Nations is supporting the work of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent and other partners to provide immediate basic assistance to new arrivals, including water, food, blankets, health assistance, and legal support. The response is now shifting to providing assistance to people in the areas where they have settled and to support host families and communities, many of whom are themselves already stretched to breaking point. More than 40,000 people have arrived in northeast Syria. The majority are being hosted in local communities, while others have requested assistance at existing camps. Our humanitarian partners are assessing the availability of contingency stocks to support them. Similar steps are being taken also in northwest Syria, where around 4,000 people have arrived, many of them report facing challenging journeys, including difficulties at checkpoints and cross points inside Syria. Madam President, distinguished members of the Council, the increased need for assistance has put pressure on an already stretched humanitarian budget and budgets across the humanitarian system. In order to scale up the UNHCR-led response, the acting emergency relief coordinator has allocated $8 million from the United Nations Central Emergency Response Fund, including for shelter, food, protection, and cash assistance for people at the border crossings and in destinations across the country. Today, I can announce that an additional $4 million from the United Nations CERF, Central Emergency Response Funding, will be provided in light of growing number of arrivals. The United Nations Syria Humanitarian Fund, managed by OCHA, is also preparing a complementary reserve allocation. However, this will only be enough to meet immediate needs. The United Nations has launched an interagency appeal for an additional $324 million to support up to 480,000 people over the next 6 months. This is in addition to the ongoing activities in relevant locations under the Humanitarian Response Plan, which is seeking some $4.1 billion, which has received some 27% of the funding, which is $1.1 billion to date. Like the Special Envoy, I thank donors for their generosity in funding the humanitarian response in Syria, and we do urge further immediate support for critical activities under these plans. Madam President, as the Special Envoy has stated, hostilities have also affected the country more directly. A number of airstrikes have hit locations along the Syria-Lebanon border, including attacks in the no man's land near the main border crossing on 4th October and as recently as yesterday, 22nd of October. The attacks have rendered the road impassable for vehicles, forcing people to cross the border on foot with whatever they could carry around the craters through the rubble. Others have had to make longer, more treacherous journeys via alternate crossings. Damage to this main road has caused significant delays to transportation of humanitarian assistance to people who need it the most and fast. And it has severed a principal commercial route for the import of key commodities through Lebanon, putting further pressure on already high prices for food and other goods. As hostilities in Lebanon persist, the risk of further disruptions will only grow. Airstrikes have also hit other locations across Syria. These include 3 strikes this month in the densely populated Mazeh neighborhoods of Damascus. These attacks have claimed the lives of at least 9 civilians, including children. The neighborhood also hosts many of the United Nations offices in Damascus and the embassies of a number of countries. One of the airstrikes landed just 100 meters from the United Nations, one of the United Nations buildings. Madam President, as you know, these developments are happening against the backdrop of one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world, one in which more than 16.7 million people are in need, and more than 7 million are internally displaced. Women and girls continue to bear the disproportionate brunt and burden, including heightened risks of gender-based violence. And the war that has created this crisis continues to add to these needs. Since mid-October, both Idlib and Western Aleppo have witnessed an increase in hostilities, including airstrikes and continued shelling. Damage to a power station resulted in electricity outages for 2 water stations serving 30,000 people. And airstrikes on 14 October also struck just kilometers from a tent settlement where a United Nations interagency team was carrying out a food distribution by the World Food Programme. Last week, 12 civilians were killed, including 3 children under the age of 10, and 40 injured in Idlib and West Aleppo over a 3-day period. Close to 2,000 families have been displaced. All of this, plus the new emergency linked to hostilities in Lebanon, continues to drive huge demand for humanitarian assistance that is perpetually under-resourced and overstretched. More than 3/4 of the way through the year, the humanitarian appeal for Syria, as I mentioned earlier, is barely a quarter funded. Again, 1.1 billion of the $4.1 billion received. Madam President, the new influx of displaced people against the backdrop of the long-term crisis in Syria only underscores the importance of identifying sustainable solutions for people who have been dependent on humanitarian assistance for years. To this end, the United Nations and its partners have finalized an early recovery strategy for the period 2024 to 2028, which will be launched in the coming weeks. The strategy aims to build support for targeted, area-based and medium-term humanitarian programming as a complement to the shorter-term interventions under the Humanitarian Response Plan. It focuses on 4 priority areas: ensuring access to health and nutrition services, enhancing access to quality education, improving management of water resources and the availability of water, sanitation and hygiene facilities, and expanding sustainable livelihoods. These will be accompanied by efforts to expand access to reliable and affordable electricity, which is fundamental for a range of services and often in short supply across Syria. I want to make clear that the expansion of early recovery projects will be an incremental process and is not an immediate replacement for emergency humanitarian services under the Humanitarian Response Plan. Indeed, the approaches are mutually supportive and are aimed at providing people with comprehensive solutions to this crisis. It is therefore vital that donors provide adequate resources both for the humanitarian appeal and for the early recovery under the new strategy. Madam President, unless the escalation in hostilities across the region is restrained, the recent impacts and destabilization we have seen in Syria could be just the start of much worse to come. Syrians have been suffering for far too long. Alongside de-escalation in the region, efforts for peace and stability in Syria are as urgent now as they have ever been. We urge the parties to conflict to commit fully to making progress in the process being facilitated by Special Envoy Pedersen. Let me end by calling on them to de-escalate, respect international humanitarian law, protect civilians, and do their utmost to ensure humanitarian assistance can reach all those in need wherever they are in Syria. I thank you.
I thank Ms. Wazonu for her briefing, and I now give the floor to Ms. Abir Haj Ibrahim.
Madam President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, representatives of the Member States of the Security Council. Thank you, Madam President, for inviting me to deliver my briefing at the Security Council and for the Council's interest in hearing the views of the Syrian civil society. I come to you today from the Levant, a region that has long suffered from armed conflicts, displacement, and destruction. What we are witnessing in our region, including my country Syria, is not a limited conflict, but an escalating one, expanding day by day. It deepens the suffering of innocent civilians and increases waves of migration and forced displacement. As Syrians, we had hoped for an end to this tragedy and to begin societal reconciliation leading to a comprehensive peace. Unfortunately, this hope has yet to be realized due to the accumulation of serious national and regional challenges affecting international peace and security. The interconnection of these challenges does not allow us, however, to neglect or focus on one without addressing the others. We are all in the same boat, and this is no longer just a romanticized slogan, but a sensitive and complex reality. When it comes to Syria, one can say it is a case of one step forward, two steps back. Despite a general de-escalation and stabilized areas of control, regional events have reignited a cycle of violence about which Mr. Pedersen has issued numerous warnings regarding its repercussions on the Syrian reality. This also reflects the intricate entanglement of regional issues and the risk of sliding into new conflicts that would destroy what remains of the Syrian society's resilience, potentially setting us back not just 2 steps but 10. Your Excellencies, Honourable Representatives, I call upon your esteemed Council to intensify coordinated international diplomatic efforts to achieve a ceasefire and diplomatic solutions in the region. Relying on a single initiative is not sufficient. We need multiple effective and coordinated diplomatic initiatives and mediations among you to resolve the escalating conflict that threatens the stability of the region and the world. You may share these concerns with us. Therefore, we need an active diplomacy with all the countries in the region and launching initiatives for solutions. Here, our efforts should be focused. At the beginning of our crisis, many tried to help us kill each other instead of opening reconciliation channels. We needed someone to encourage dialogue, which made communication difficult and increased the rift between our communities. However, there were successful attempts to transcend the conflict involving diverse segments of society. Today, we need to expand these dialogues to address the core issues we have disagreed upon. There is a genuine desire to work towards community reconciliation as a step towards positive peace. This reconciliation should reach as many communities in Syria as possible, focusing on our identities, belonging, and cultural differences constructively, in a way that would allow us to address our pain and wounds, including the release of detainees and abductees and revealing the fate of those forcibly disappeared by all parties. Our cities, under various authorities, must start serious dialogues to enhance understanding and open opportunities for peace building. The responsibility for leading these dialogues lies upon the civil society, and you have to support these efforts. Dialogue is also essential at the diplomatic level among all actors, and local dialogues can guide us towards the desired solutions. Projects related to livelihoods in Syria will not succeed without initiating serious dialogues about the economic blockade and over-compliance. This situation increases the likelihood of new conflicts over increasingly scarce resources, exacerbating the economic and social situation. Addressing the economic blockade and overcompliance is a crucial step to support projects that improve livelihoods and restore dignity to Syrian women and men. Let us build our schools, hospitals, and universities to offer our children and youth better opportunities away from violence and displacement. I stress the need to expand consultations and coordination with the active women peace builders in Syria and across the region. Women, with their unique experiences and creative visions, are the most capable of offering initiatives that help end violent conflicts and achieve sustainable peace. You can also build genuine, equitable partnerships in a global ecosystem that includes civil society, governments, UN, local, international, and local organizations. All these stakeholders each have a strength to bring to the table. When I was a little girl, I often saw images of this council on our TV, and I used to wonder about your role and why you sat in an open circle. I would ask my father about the reason, but I didn't understand it back then. Years later, I found myself inside that very circle. Today, I realize it represents more than just a design. It symbolizes a clear path away from war, breaking the cycle of violence. Use it in full to lead us towards peace, raising your hands for progress and dignity. I share this memory with you because I truly believe that your council still has the power to be a force for peace. The decisions you make here have the potential to pave the way for a ceasefire and to adopt diplomacy as a force for finding solutions. I urge you to remember the innocent lives, especially women and children, who are caught in the heart of conflicts and can be saved. My plea today is simple. Let us end violence. Let us have a deep dialogue around sanctions, stifling our ambitions and future. Let us invest in diplomacy at every level, from local dialogues to international negotiations. Most importantly, let us ensure that the Security Council lives up to its responsibility as a guardian of peace, bringing hope, reassurance, and dignity for all. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Ibrahim for her briefing. And I now give the floor to Ms. Suad Jabawi.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, last September, I addressed this council, warning that the humanitarian situation inside Syria continues to plunge to unfathomable depths. A further year has passed, and the devastating truth is that we are still yet to reach the bottom. Much of what I warned of in this room a year ago still holds true. Last year, we warned that without concerted action to address the drivers of crisis, yet even more Syrians would be pulled into poverty and despair. Today, as you have already heard from OCHA, the number of people in need of humanitarian assistance has risen to unprecedented levels. Last year, we warned that with an economy in free fall, many of those we serve were having to make impossible choices, such as whether to eat or send their children to school. Today, we are seeing cases of children suffering from acute malnutrition increasing at alarming rates, unheard of in Syria before the conflict began. Malnutrition now threatens the long-term development of thousands who survive. Last year, we warned how a substantial funding gap was forcing humanitarian organizations to make difficult decisions about which vulnerable families to serve. Today, we have a humanitarian system simply incapable of keeping pace, all while Syrians continue to call out for tangible support to become genuinely self-reliant. I join you tonight from Amman, Jordan, having just returned this morning from visiting the IRC team and partners in Idlib in northwest Syria. While there, I heard firsthand how Syrian civilians continue to suffer the effects of perpetual conflict. As we've already heard, in the last month alone, we have witnessed a significant escalation of violence in areas we work. Airstrikes, shelling, and drone attacks have caused the death and injury of scores of civilians, and yet again, the displacement of thousands of people in search of safety. Just last week, airstrikes damaged residential areas, agricultural lands, and as noted by other speakers, a power station, affecting the water station that services 30,000 people across 17 villages. With perpetual conflict comes perpetual uncertainty. Syrians I spoke to in Idlib explained to me how they are living in a constant state of limbo. When they wake, they do not know if today will be the day that they are able to plow their fields, or a day where they have to flee attacks again. It had been 10 years since I was last in Idlib. And I think what has struck me most is just how normalized negative coping mechanisms have become. Parents no longer recognize and realize that they are eating one meal a day instead of 3. The reality is that Syrian families now find themselves suspended between their ability to survive daily challenges and their ability to recover and rebuild, stripping away their basic dignity of being able to make choices, good choices, regarding their lives and futures. I asked a Syrian displaced from Deir ez-Zor a decade ago if he is optimistic about a political solution to the crisis. And he answered before I even got to finish the question. Absolutely not. He told me we have lost faith and confidence a long time ago. The failure to bring about any meaningful progress towards a political solution has, with it, stifled any meaningful effort to address the drivers of humanitarian need. As a result of this failure, we have no choice but to change the paradigm of how we collectively respond in Syria. While many Syrians have given up on the international community to facilitate political solutions, they have not given up on maintaining their social fabric in support of each other. For too long, we have been focused on providing the Band-Aid, when in fact Syrians consistently tell us that what they really need are collective efforts to support their recovery. One Syrian woman I spoke to this week summed it better than I could. We want to take care of ourselves, and we need a different kind of assistance to get there, one that rests on cooperation between all of us. As we think about the need for greater investment in recovery, it is important to note that what is happening today in Syria is not happening in a vacuum. It has truly been a devastating year for many of us in the Middle East region. We continue to watch the horrors, the catastrophic horrors, the impact of death and destruction in the occupied Palestinian territory and now in Lebanon. The escalations of conflict in Lebanon has led to the mass forced displacement of more than 425,000 Lebanese and Syrians into Syria, with those crossing the border fleeing one crisis only to find themselves in another. This movement occurs at the same time as some international actors increasingly look to promote the prospect of large-scale returns to Syria. It is crucial that we recognize this latest wave of displacement for what it is. It is not a safe, voluntary, sustainable, or dignified choice, but again, a false choice, a choice between being caught in either an active conflict zone or a perpetual conflict now 14 years in the making. Unless there is genuine movement on the political file, then both tangible improvements to the humanitarian situation as well as the conditions needed for large-scale voluntary returns in safety and dignity will continue to elude us all. It is not lost on me, as I am sure you all, that 12 months ago I sat here and delivered a very similar message. I hope that if I am offered the opportunity to brief this council again in the future, that we will have finally passed the nadir and will be able to look together towards Syria's recovery. Abir said it better than I could. I end today in urging all of us not to forget those in need in Syria and to once again emphasize the responsibilities of this council to protect all Syrians wherever they are. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Jodbaroui for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
And thank you, Special Envoy Pedersen, Director Warsornu, and civil society support room representatives for your briefings. Let me just say at the start that our civil society briefers, I want to say to them how important it is that the Security Council regularly hear your perspectives and learn about your efforts. Madam President, the United States is deeply concerned about Syrian refugees in Lebanon and Lebanese civilians who have been displaced by the current conflict there. They are faced with the impossible choice of fleeing within Lebanon or crossing Lebanon's borders to insecurity in Syria. We are working to help the most vulnerable refugees, internally displaced persons, and host communities as they respond to the crisis. On September 26, the United States announced nearly $534 million in additional humanitarian assistance for the Syrian people, including assistance provided through international organization partners. The United States continues to uphold our commitment to the Syrian people, as well as displaced Lebanese, and we urge other donors to join us in stepping up to fill the significant funding gaps so partners can continue to meet the needs of the most vulnerable. The regime and all parties in Syria must allow immediate and unhindered humanitarian access across all areas of Syria for as long as needs persist. We take note of recent improvements in UNHCR's access to returnees, both at the border and in their areas of return. We also note the Syrian regime's decision to temporarily suspend exploitative fees for Syrians returning to their country. These steps are positive, but long overdue, and much more work remains to be done. As such, we continue to support UNHCR's efforts to improve the protection environment in Syria. In this context, we are very concerned about continued reports of abuses against returnees, including the regime arbitrarily detaining returnees. Returns will never be truly voluntary, safe, dignified, or sustainable until the regime changes its ways and upholds human rights and fundamental freedoms for all. We also note with alarm the recent escalation in regime and Russian attacks on northwest Syria that have caused scores of deaths and injuries. Russian or regime strikes also damaged critical civilian infrastructure, including a key power plant, leaving dozens of communities without drinking water. Under the pretense of fighting terrorism in northwest Syria, the regime in Russia are carrying out brutal attacks on civilians that have left Syrian families homeless, deprived of food and water, and brutally maimed or killed. Such horrors repeat themselves in Assad Syria week in and week out. Turning to the political process, we continue to support Special Envoy Pedersen's efforts and call on the regime to commit to a meeting of the Constitutional Committee regardless of the location. We expect to hear the same old empty rhetoric from the regime here today. It will rehash the same tired arguments, blaming sanctions and the West for all their problems. But in fact, it is the regime's deep fear of serious dialogue that has ground the Constitutional Committee to a halt. And it is the regime's own corruption, kleptocracy, and wanton violence that has driven Syrians into poverty. The regime could alleviate the suffering of its people simply by coming to the negotiating table in good faith, an easy step it refuses to take. While the Assad regime refuses to engage in a political process, ordinary Syrians continue to suffer. The only way to end their suffering remains a political solution in line with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. To conclude, I reiterate the call for the immediate release of Austin Tice. 12 terrible years have passed since he was abducted in Syria and held by the Syrian regime. The United States has repeatedly pressed Damascus to work with us so that we can at last bring Austin home. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we would like to thank the Special Envoy for Syria, Mr. Pedersen, and the Director of OJA, Edom Bosornu. We thank them for their briefings on the situation in Syria. We also followed very closely the statements made by the representatives of the civil society. We expect that the Special Envoy will continue with his efforts to renew the inter-Syrian dialogue in line with Resolution 2254, and we continue expecting from you, Geir, news about the next meeting of the Constitutional Committee at the place which would be agreeable to all Syrians, and we believe that this should be possible to do. Distinguished colleagues, I don't think anyone will object to the statement that the number of factors which are threatening the stability of Syria has grown considerably recently. And this is not because of what is being done by the legal Syrian authorities or the errors, as our Western colleagues are trying to describe. What this is that despite the very charged atmosphere in the region and the real possibility that Syria will be provoked by Israel to a fully fledged military clash, Washington and its satellites continue with their destructive and inhumane course vis-à-vis Damascus. And this was not at all influenced by the sharp uptick in the number of refugees who are fleeing from the military actions of IDF in Lebanon, which in itself creates major challenges for neighboring states. According to the data we have and heard today, in the recent weeks, more than 400,000 Lebanese and Syrians entered Syria. About 60% of them are children. 1,500 are people with disabilities, and more than 3,000 are pregnant women. And all of them arrive in Syria while physically and emotionally extremely unwell, and they need help urgently. We note that the Syrian government and local communities, even under the harshest possible unilateral coercive measures by the United States and the European Union, measures which are nothing but a collective punishment doled out on everyday Syrians. They strip them down to their last shirt. And despite that, they're doing everything to meet the basic needs of those who arrive. According to our information, in areas neighboring Lebanon, there are 20 temporary shelters deployed, and people are also housed in hotels, free of charge mostly, and in private houses. Work is also being done to send children to school. Most people end up in Damascus and the surrounding areas. The Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Wosorno did mention that today, and we're grateful to them for it. But we're very surprised by the fact that these facts are not even mentioned in the UN documents, nor is it being mentioned that the Syrian authorities are meeting international organizations and refugees' every need. They provide for streamlined entry procedures and help UN and NGOs to work freely at border crossings and to feed the needy. The UN has to provide an objective assessment of the efforts that are being made by the Syrian authorities. Time has come to end playing along with what is being done by the Western countries. For 7 years running now, they have not been able to allow the Secretary General to publicly distance himself from the Internal Secretariat document of 2017, which is called the Parameters and Principles of Humanitarian Assistance to Syria, which goes along with the anti-Damascus policy of the Western donors. It runs counter to the UN Charter and the UNGA Resolution 46/182 on humanitarian activity. I'm not even mention the so-called Friends of Syria, the Western countries here in this room, because they prefer talking about the horrors of Syria that the returning Syrians returning from Lebanon would have to face in Syria. The UN Secretary General and the staff need to be more decisive and assertive now and insist that donors stop politicizing assistance to Syrians. By the way, we learned that currently the UN bodies are working on something that's called the Early Recovery Plan for Syria. And we would like to know in advance what this plan consists of. We think that Damascus would want the same, and we insist on making sure that the first item in this plan consists of rejecting all politically biased preconditions for the launching of development projects. But regardless of whether or not the UN leadership will have enough courage to do their duty towards Syria and prevent the politicization of humanitarian efforts, support its people, nonetheless, we're convinced that the humanitarian bodies have the obligation to show solidarity with the authorities of Syria in hosting refugees, providing them food, healthcare, and housing. Otherwise, all of your pretty statements and appeals to being humanitarian and solidarity are simply worthless. We welcome in this context the efforts made by countries who are not indifferent to collect and send assistance to the destitute. Iran and Pakistan, for example, have sent some shipments. The Center for Reconciliation of Opposing Sides of Russia have distributed food packages. On the 13th of October, a charter arrived in Damascus from Moscow with food and medical equipment which had been collected by the Syrian diaspora in Venezuela. Madam President, we can see that the spiral of violence in the Middle East every day worsens the situation in Syria. It creates the risk of bringing it into the broadening confrontation. We're witnessing area bombardments and the ground invasion by the IDF into Lebanon, and we can see that the number of indiscriminate Israeli air strikes against Syria, including Damascus and Latakia, is growing. According to the Syrian Human Rights Monitoring Center, since the beginning of 2024, 119 attacks were conducted. 97 of them involved aviation and 22 involved artillery. Basically, every day this leads to the death of civilians. As recently as yesterday, as a result of yet another strike against the area of Meze in the capital, 2 people were killed. And such acts in violation of Syria's sovereignty and other Arab countries' sovereignty, as well as the fact that there is no reaction from the UN, leave us deeply disappointed. Against this background, one of the key destabilizing factors on the ground has been and remains the illegal military presence of the United States in the Trans-Euphrates and surrounding Tanf on the southeast of Syria, where active work is being done to recruit and train fighters into various terrorist groups, including ISIL. And we already know for a fact now that the representatives of Kiev regime are actively interacting with them. The Ukrainian emissaries, in particular, are very actively cooperating with the fighters from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham who are in Idlib, and they exchange their terrorist skills with them. The United States and its allies pretend they do not notice this, even though here we're talking about internationally designated terrorists. This kind of flirting on the part of our Western colleagues with the terrorists and the attempts to use them for their own geopolitical goals is something that deserves most decisive condemnation. But Washington continues occupying vast areas in the northeast of Syria, continues looting the oil and agricultural resources of this country, but is also triggering a further worsening of the socio-economic situation and is trying to revitalize the extremist underground in Syria. And in this regard, we'd like to say that we stand together with the legitimate demands on the part of Syria to withdraw all illegitimate military contingents from the country. They violate the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the country, and the demand to stop the airstrikes against Syria, their flagrant violation of international law. We also call on the specialized UN agencies to conduct coordinated work to mobilize funding for Syria, at least within the parameters which have already been pledged by the governments of various countries. To date, the humanitarian appeal for Syria is only 27% funded. This is unacceptably low for the country that's facing these challenges. Syria has huge potential, and if you do not impede that potential, and if you do not loot its resources, then the country can firmly stand up on its own 2 feet. We're made optimistic by the fact that over the 13 years of serious challenges and efforts to undermine its sovereignty and statehood nonetheless managed to keep its very high human potential. It's no coincidence that the University of Damascus recently became included in the international rating of best universities in the world. And we call upon all who truly want to uphold universal humanitarian principles, not use them as a cover for their geopolitical games, to outstretch a helping hand to the Syrians in their hour of need and contribute to the future of the Syrian state. I thank you. I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Madam President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the member of the A3+, namely Guyana, Mozambique, Sierra Leone, and my own country, Algeria. At the outset, the members of the A3+ would like to thank Mr. Pedersen and Mrs. Wozornu for their valuable briefings. We also listened carefully to the representative of the civil society. The A3+ welcomes the participation of our colleagues from Syria, Iran, and Turkey at this meeting. I wish to express to the permanent representative of Turkey our heartfelt condolences to the family of the victim of this horrific terrorist attacks carried out today in Ankara. Our thoughts are with the people of Turkey during this difficult time, and we stand in solidarity with them as they face this tragedy. Madam President, we meet today as the situation in the Middle East continues to worsen, with the path to a viable solution becoming increasingly elusive and complex. The suffering of the Syrian people has persisted for far too long, and it is imperative that we work seriously towards its resolution. The fighting in Gaza and Lebanon, alongside rising instability in the Syrian Golan, are profoundly affecting Syria. The A3+ is gravely concerned that the already fragile security and humanitarian situation could easily plunge Syria back into a cycle of violence, an outcome we all seek to avoid. In this regard, we note the Syria letter dated of 14 October 2024, reporting that, I quote, an Israeli airstrike from the direction of northern Lebanon hit the Homs countryside industrial zone, causing significant material damage to public and private property. The A3+ express deep concern over reports of demining activities within the Envoy area of operation and condemn all violation of Syria's sovereignty. We reiterate our call for de-escalation and a nationwide ceasefire, as well as a regional ceasefire, in particular in Gaza and Lebanon. We urge maximum restraint from all actors in the region and to spare Syria from further military confrontation. The recent incident reported over the past weeks, coupled with the re-emergence of the terrorist threat in Syria, remind us all of the urgent need for a political solution to the crisis, one that safeguards Syria's unity, Syria's sovereignty, Syria's independence, and Syria's territorial integrity. We must ensure the continued protection of the UNDOF presence on the Golan and uphold the 1974 disengagement agreement, which has been a cornerstone for regional stability in decades. The A3+ reaffirmed its support for a Syrian-owned and a Syrian-led political process, which is the only pathway to a solution as laid out in Resolution 2254. In this regard, we emphasize the urgency of convening the Constitutional Committee. In this context, we renew our support to the Special Envoy in his endeavor and call on all stakeholders to engage constructively with him to break the current deadlock in the political process. The A3+ believes that through inclusive dialogue among Syrians, with the backing of the international community, a sustainable solution can be achieved. Madam President, OCHA's briefings have consistently highlighted the alarming humanitarian situation in Syria. The humanitarian response plan is only 27% funded, while 70% of the population is in need of humanitarian assistance. This dire situation has been exacerbated by the recent influx of Syrians returning to their country. According to UNHCR, over 400,000 people have fled the violence in Lebanon and crossed back into Syria. Addressing this emergency will require tremendous effort and support from the international community to mobilize significant resources. And Syria was not prepared for this crisis and will not be able to manage it alone. The A3+ calls on all donors to assist Syria and the humanitarian community in supporting Syrian returnees and Lebanese refugees. We also express grave concern about the impact of the humanitarian crisis on children, particularly on their education and mental health. With one third of children reported to be suffering from psychosocial distress. Rehabilitating Syria's health system is crucial. The A3+ looks forward to the launch of the early recovery strategy and welcomes the focus on health and nutrition services within its framework. While the international community must not lose sight of the ongoing humanitarian emergency, the A3 believes that a developmental approach is equally necessary. Syria cannot rely on humanitarian aid indefinitely. It must be empowered to face its socio-economic challenges, including by the lifting of unilateral sanctions. In conclusion, Madam President, the A3+ firmly believes that the solution to Syria's crisis can only be political and must be decided by the Syrian people themselves. The international community and this very council must help the Syrians find a resolution to a conflict that has plagued their country for over 13 years. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
President, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA Director Vosorno for their briefings, as well as Ms. Ibrahim and Ms. Jarbawi for their valuable contributions. Madam President, against the backdrop of escalating tensions that are engulfing the wider Middle East, progress on a political solution in Syria and beyond is urgently needed. In addition to intensified hostilities in parts of Syria, we are witnessing the spillover effects of regional escalations, in particular the war in Gaza and the ongoing hostilities in Lebanon. As we've heard today from the Special Envoy, they both have a direct impact on Syria. The situation is not sustainable and the need for maximum restraint and calm is critical. Slovenia reiterates its urgent call for an immediate end to the hostilities in Lebanon, a ceasefire in Gaza, and a de-escalation across the region, including in Syria, in line with the Security Council Resolution 2254, working toward a nationwide ceasefire. The implication of regional tensions for Syria and Syrians are alarming. Tens of thousands of Syrians, many of whom have been displaced multiple times, are once again fleeing for their lives. On the other hand, hundreds of thousands of children, women and men are crossing into Syria on foot, gripped by overwhelming fear and anguish. They urgently require humanitarian assistance. Reports indicate that at least 60% of those crossing are under the age of 18. Among them are Syrians who had already fled to Lebanon because of the conflict in their homeland. Now, they face a state of terror and destitution, forced to relive the nightmare and uncertainty of displacement yet again. We should be under no illusion that Syrians are making voluntary and informed decisions to return to Syria. Slovenia is particularly concerned about the reports that a number of Syrians who crossed from Lebanon into Syria to flee the war have been arrested upon their arrival. Syria already has one of the highest numbers of detained, abducted and missing persons in the world. It is clear humanitarian imperative that the fate and whereabouts of missing persons in Syria are clarified. The current displacement crisis adds an additional burden on Syria and its local responders, who are still in the midst of a widespread humanitarian crisis, with almost 17 million people in need of humanitarian assistance throughout the country, the highest in over a decade of conflict that severely damaged basic civilian infrastructure. Slovenia also reiterates that Syria needs sustainable, predictable, and efficient aid flows, including cross-border and cross-line aid, across the entire country for as long as needed. Humanitarian actors need greater predictability to plan their activities, and they must be able to conduct their work safely. This can be done only if all parties comply with international humanitarian law. Madam President, in conclusion, as the situation is becoming more dangerous and unpredictable with each passing day, we reiterate our full support to Special Envoy's efforts, and we call on all parties to cooperate substantively and fully toward delivering a lasting political settlement in Syria. Peace is definitely worth more than any political or military victory. People of Syria need and deserve peace after enduring over a decade of war. Peace will only be sustainable if inclusive and just. It is therefore worth repeating that accountability and justice for victims are a sine qua non towards achieving this goal. Everyone responsible for breaches of international humanitarian law and violations and abuses of human rights must be held accountable. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and OCHA Director Wilson for their informative briefings. I also thank Ms. Abil Haj Ibrahim and Ms. Suad Jarvawi on their briefings. The rapid escalation of hostilities in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah over the past month has taken a toll on Syria. More than 425,000 people, both Syrian and Lebanese, have fled across the border. This has created enormous humanitarian needs and caused the already precarious security situation to deteriorate even further. The international community must act to halt the expansion of the crisis, destabilizing the Middle East. In order to prevent further escalation of the conflict in Lebanon, Japan strongly urges the parties to exercise maximum restraint and to make sincere efforts toward a diplomatic settlement. Madam President, regarding the political track in Syria, Japan reaffirms its support to Special Envoy Pedersen and his engagement with all stakeholders. We also note his meetings in late September with Syria's new Foreign Minister, Bassam al-Sabag. The international community needs to continue backing the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political process established in Security Council Resolution 2254 and extensive facilitation efforts led by the Special Envoy. It is regrettable the Constitutional Committee has not convened for more than 2 years. Japan expresses its strong hope that it will do so at the earliest. Madam President, even before the arrival of people fleeing Lebanon, Syria was facing one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world. Life for Syrians has seen no significant improvement for years. More than 70% of them are in need, lacking critical infrastructure and suffering from high inflation and a severe economic downturn. Japan emphasizes the necessity of effectively implementing all available modalities to deliver the aid. We value the continued efforts to enhance cross-line deliveries. At the same time, smooth cross-border support is crucial to accommodate the needs of the population in northwest Syria. We stress the importance of supporting the efforts of relevant UN agencies under the coordination of OCHA. It is worrisome that the humanitarian response plan for Syria is still significantly underfunded, with a greater funding shortfall than at this time last year. Since 2012, Japan has provided emergency and humanitarian aid through UN agencies and others, which amount to $35 billion. We encourage donors to provide whatever assistance they can to address the urgent needs of the population. Additionally, it is essential to invest in early recovery and resilience to help establish a strong foundation for a stable and safer Syria. Madam President, Japan is committed, both through humanitarian aid and political engagement, to support the people of Syria and their aspirations for a better future. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam President. I welcome the information provided by Special Envoy Geir Pedersen, by the Director of OCHA Operations, Adam Wosornu, and the representative of civil society. I also welcome the presence among us today of the permanent representatives of Syria, Iran, and Turkey. Colleagues, Ecuador recognizes the efforts of the Special Envoy to promote trust and renew political will among the stakeholders in order to reactivate a multi-stakeholder dialogue and substantive dialogue pursuant to Resolution 2254 of 2015. The escalation of violence and instability in the region have direct consequences on security in Syria and are a threat to peace and security in this area. It is urgent to implement coordinated diplomatic actions in order to ensure an immediate cessation of hostilities in Lebanon and in Gaza, as well as to halt the spread of terrorism and violent extremism in the Syrian territory. My delegation joins the appeal by the international community for moderation and restraint, diplomacy for peace, and a genuine concern about the impact of violence on the civilian population must prevail. Madam President, we welcome the initiative taken by the Humanitarian Task Force for Syria to hold an emergency meeting in order to assess other options to mitigate the worsening humanitarian situation. The region is experiencing one of the most acute displacement crises in recent years. The civilian population in Lebanon and in Syria, many of whom are women and children, have been forced into displacement due to the conflict. it is essential to mobilize funds to address humanitarian needs of IDPs during transit and in shelters, and also to address the specific needs of unaccompanied minors and reduce their vulnerability to other forms of violence, such as sexual and gender-based violence, as well as trafficking for purposes of exploitation, to mention but a few. My delegation encourages Special Envoy Peterson to explore any alternative which might help overcome the stalemate in political negotiations and restore and help resume the Constitutional Committee meetings. To further delay a resumption of talks will just lead to an environment of despair and a sense of abandonment. Let me state and underscore that the only way out of the crisis in Syria is political. We must do everything possible and exhaust all efforts to bring relief to the civilian population and open the path for peace and national reconciliation. I thank the representative of Ecuador, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Wasonu for their briefings. And I'd also like to thank Ms. Ibrahim and Ms. Jabawi for their invaluable insights on the humanitarian and political situation in Syria. I'd like to make 3 points today. First, the conflict in Lebanon has had a devastating impact on civilians, including Syrians, who had sought refuge from the Assad regime in Lebanon. Hundreds of thousands of Syrian, Lebanese and Palestinian people are now fleeing into Syria, where, tragically, they will face further conflict. However, let me be clear that this movement of people does not mean that Assad has met the conditions to facilitate the safe return of Syrians, something we and the international community have long called for. Syria remains unsafe for voluntary, safe and dignified returns. Sadly, those fleeing are motivated by desperation and not the promise of a safe home. We urge the Syrian authorities to protect the rights and safety of these displaced civilians. Whilst UNHCR's increased monitoring capacity on the border is welcome, it is essential that the UN has full access to continue this monitoring across the country. Second, as we've heard from our briefers, the humanitarian situation in Syria, with a record 16.7 million people in need, threatens to deteriorate even further with dwindling resources. We cannot allow essential services to collapse. A coordinated response across Syria, building on existing humanitarian structures, is urgently needed to respond to these needs. For our part, the UK has mobilised programming and funding in response to the displacement crisis in Syria, committing over $3.8 million. As needs continue to grow, it is essential that humanitarian organisations can deliver life-saving assistance free from interference or restriction. Third, we are concerned by the increased violence and civilian casualties across Syria in recent weeks. This includes in northwest Syria, where attacks by the Assad regime and its Russian backer have displaced thousands of Syrians and resulted in civilian casualties. Airstrikes have been conducted near displacement camps, have halted schools and health services, and have impacted water distribution facilities. All of this in a region where humanitarian need is already staggering. The escalation across the region is a sobering reminder of the devastating price civilians pay for ongoing conflict and violence. The solution in Syria is clear, and I reiterate our call for the Assad regime and all parties to Syria's conflict to engage meaningfully in the political process in line with Resolution 2254. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom. I now call on the representative of Malta.
Thank you, Madam President, and I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Wosornu for their briefings. I also thank Ms. Ibrahim and Ms. Jarbawi for sharing their experience with us today. Madam President, the consequences of the ongoing instability in the region, most vividly the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza and the ongoing military operations in Lebanon, are evident. In the past week, we have witnessed airstrikes targeting Damascus and Latakia. Bombardment in the northwest of Syria by Russian aircraft and shelling by the Syrian army has resulted in civilian casualties, the damage of schools, and the forced displacement of hundreds of families. Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon have displaced nearly 400,000 people, forcing both Syrian refugees and Lebanese civilians to seek shelter in a war-torn Syria. Civilians are already paying the highest price. An immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon is urgent, including to prevent a catastrophe that would engulf the entire region. Before these recent escalations, the humanitarian toll of the crisis in Syria was already staggering. Over 70% of Syria's population is in desperate need of assistance. The malnutrition crisis has tripled in 5 years. The cost of living has doubled, and 3.1 million people now face acute food insecurity. These are not just numbers. They reflect the daily suffering of millions. Malta commends the tireless work of OCHA and its humanitarian partners who, against all odds, are reaching over 4 million Syrians each month. The UN and its partners are a critical lifeline to the most vulnerable across the country. We are also heartened by the UN's vaccination catch-up campaign and the scaling up of winterization efforts, both of which will provide much-needed relief in the coming months. Unhindered humanitarian access remains essential. The most direct routes for cross-border and cross-line assistance must remain open. As long as the humanitarian needs persist, so too must the access routes, ensuring that help reaches all those in need. Yet, we cannot ignore the larger humanitarian gap in Syria. The lack of adequate resources, not only for emergency assistance, but also for early recovery, livelihoods, and resilience building, remains a significant concern. Madam President, this Council has a clear mandate and responsibility. We must ensure the full implementation of Resolution 2254. The ill-fated obstructions by all parties to the conflict in Syria must now end. Damascus and the Syrian opposition must act and engage now. A nationwide ceasefire remains the immediate necessity. All parties must commit to moving forward with the resumed Constitutional Committee and engage earnestly with the good offices of the Special Envoy. Only through genuine dialogue can we begin to build the just and lasting peace the country deserves. In this regard, Malta reaffirms its support for the UN's independent institution on missing persons and emphasizes the importance of carrying out this mandate in a gender-responsive and survivor-centered manner. After 14 years of war, Syria's future hangs by a thread. Its economy, security, and society are in ruins, and millions have fled, fearful to return. The current wars unfolding across the Middle East threaten to tip Syria into total collapse. The responsibility falls on this Council and those with influence over the parties to ensure that civilians of Syria are protected from the devastating consequences of an all-out regional war. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Malta. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam President, I would like to thank Mr. Pedersen and Ms. Wosornu for their briefings, and I thank Ms. Haji Ibrahim and Ms. Jabawi for their statements. I also would like to express condolences to the Permanent Representative of Turkey in the wake of the terrorist attack in Ankara today. The crises in Gaza and Lebanon present the danger of a regional conflagration which can extend to Syria, and we have to do everything that it doesn't happen. All of the actors have to show restraint and work towards de-escalation. Civilian populations will be the first to pay the price if a new front is opened. These regions are in addition to the continued hostilities in Syria, with the re-emergence of Daesh, the traffic of Captagon, and continued violence by the regime and its supporters against the people. The Russian bombardments on the 14th, 16th against the population of Idlib resulted in dozens of deaths, and they've shown that. At this time of an acute crisis in the Middle East, the need to have a credible political process, which meets the hopes and aspirations of the Syrians, is the only way of arriving at a just and lasting peace. We already provide there is a tangible and verifiable progress towards a political process to start lifting sanctions and consider financing reconstruction. But in the immediate future, we would like to reiterate our trust in Mr. Peterson to implement all of the aspects of Resolution 2254. More than 400,000 people, Syrians and Lebanese, have fled the Israeli military operations in Lebanon to go to Syria. We have to help them, as we have to help the displaced in Lebanon and the Syrian refugees who are still there. We have to continue exerting pressure on the regime to lift the obstacles preventing the return of the refugees, and that's the rationale behind our work with the HCR and partners. The humanitarian situation continues deteriorating in Syria, where 70% of the population finds itself in an emergency situation. Continued hostilities and the risk of escalation in the region only emphasize the humanitarian needs where financing is lacking. We are concerned by the consequences of the 13 years of war on the civilians, in particular children, the malnourishing and psychological distress. We call on all states to meet the emergency needs. We recall that international humanitarian law imposes on everyone everywhere in Syria. We recall the vital nature of cross-border supplies of humanitarian assistance, which helps 2.4 million people, in particular in the Northwest. The efforts to supply cross lines should continue. We call on the regime to continue with the authorizations without limiting them in time through Bab al-Hawa and the Bab al-Salam and al-Rai passages, which otherwise will come to an end on the 13th of November. I thank you. I thank France. I give the floor to China.
President, I thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Wosono for their briefings. I have also carefully listened to the statements from the two representatives of the civil society. I would like to make 3 comments. First, with the conflict in Gaza being protracted and the situation between Lebanon and Israel deteriorating, the international community must work together to prevent the conflict from spreading to Syria. China strongly condemns Israel's frequent airstrikes in Syria and calls on Israel to immediately stop such attacks. We call on all parties concerned to respect in real earnest Syria's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity, and make concrete efforts to maintain stability in regional countries, Syria included. Foreign forces must end their illegal military presence in Syria. Second, it is reported that HTS, Daesh, and other terrorist forces have recently intensified their activities in Syria. China is gravely concerned. China firmly supports the Syrian government in taking the necessary counterterrorism measures. We call on the international community to abide by the international law and the Council resolutions, take uniform standard, and work together with zero tolerance to fight against terrorist forces in Syria and prevent them from exploiting the current situation and adding more destabilizing factors to an already volatile situation. Third, as a result of the recent situation between Lebanon and Israel, there has been massive inflow of refugees into Syria. China commends the Syrian government for their positive actions to host the refugees. We welcome UNHCR's issuance of emergency humanitarian appeal and hope to see synergy from the international community in jointly addressing the situation. I wish to stress that improvement in Syria's economic and social resilience will fundamentally help improve the country's humanitarian situation. We look forward to the early release by the UN of the early recovery strategy for Syria, with a view to supporting early recovery projects across Syria. Unilateral sanctions seriously impede the efforts towards improving the humanitarian situation in Syria and should be lifted immediately. In conclusion, I wish to reiterate that political settlement is the only path for the question of Syria. China welcomes the dialogue and consultations among all parties in Syria to enhance mutual trust. We support Special Envoy Pedersen's continued work with all parties under the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned principle. We hope that the existing dialogue mechanisms will complement each other and, on the basis of full communication and consultation with the Syrian government, form synergy and facilitate a political settlement. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China and now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President, Madam Chair. I would also like to thank Special Envoy Pedersen and Director Worsonu for their briefing today. My delegation also would like to commend noble efforts the civil society has been making to bring about peace in Syria and the region. Taking this opportunity, we express our deepest condolences to the victims and their families affected by the tragic acts of terror in Ankara today, standing firmly with the people of Turkey in this time of grief. Security in Syria is rapidly degrading as regional escalation pulls the country further into conflict, with a sharp increase in airstrike across Syria. And hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees in Lebanon once again fleeing for their lives back into Syria. In this context, I'd like to make the following 3 points. First, all parties in the region must prioritize de-escalation at all costs. My delegation is gravely concerned by the dramatic rise in airstrikes on multiple fronts, including northwest Syria and areas near Damascus, carried out by regional powers. Exploiting the current situation, while seemingly advantageous, will only further destabilize Syria and the wider region, serving no one's long-term interests. Despite the significant challenges, we urge all parties to recommit to the political process under Security Council Resolution 2254, which remains the only agreed upon path forward. Second, the safe, dignified, and voluntary return of refugees and IDPs must be ensured at all times. The recent influx of returnees into Syria does not imply that their return had been resolved. Rather, it exemplifies how volatile the region has become, as Syria is now seen as less dangerous than neighboring Lebanon, long a refuge for Syrians. In this regard, we express concern over the Syrian government's amnesty decree issued in September 2024. While it allegedly offers general amnesty, its limitations leave many returnees vulnerable to legal uncertainties and the potential persecution and conscription. We urge the Syrian authorities to halt any prosecutions or forcible conscriptions of refugees for any reason. We also note the Syrian government's 8-point declaration made during the UNHCR Executive Committee in October 2023. Reports indicate that the recent entry process has been facilitated in line with this declaration, allowing refugees to enter the country more easily, which we view as a positive development. Third, the dire humanitarian situation exacerbated by spillover from Lebanon's crisis demands urgent international attention. Refugee influxes into areas with insufficient aid underscore the need for immediate global actions to avoid further catastrophe. As pledged At this year's Brussels Syria conference in May, the Republic of Korea is committed to addressing the Syrian crisis, providing a total of $26 million for Syria and its neighboring countries, including Lebanon. Korea will continue to do our part. We commend OCHA, UNHCR, and their partner organizations in delivering critical assistance to refugees and returnees, particularly at border crossings, shelters, and in host communities. Their work is indispensable. And as the crisis continues to deepen, they will require continued support to meet the growing need on the ground. We call on the Syrian government to authorize continuous humanitarian access through the Bab al-Salam and Alai crossings without expiration dates, as these crossings are crucial for delivering aid to the most vulnerable and must not be disrupted. In closing, we urge all parties to urgently cease hostilities, prioritize the safety and dignity of refugees, and recommit to a political solution that ensures lasting peace in Syria. I thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea, and I will now make a statement in my national capacity. Like my colleagues, I would like to thank Special Envoy Geir Pedersen and Director of Operations and Advocacy at OSHU, Adam Wasornu, for their statements and also for their considerable commitment. I would also like to warmly thank Ms. Abir Haji Ibrahim and Ms. Suad Jabawi for responding to Switzerland's invitation to offer this Council their perspectives, rooted in the experience of Syrian civil society since the beginning of the conflict. In Syria, civil society is making a crucial contribution to the delivery of humanitarian aid and to the search for lasting peace and reconciliation throughout the entire country. In this respect, it is important to highlight the role of Syrian women who are constantly committed to an inclusive political process led by Syria under the auspices of the UN and its Special Envoy in accordance with UN Security Council Resolution 2254. On their own initiative or through platforms such as the Civil Society Support Room and the Women's Consultative Council under the aegis of the Special Envoy's office, Syrian women are working tenaciously to heal the wounds and rebuild the social fabric that a decade of conflict has torn apart. Working to provide answers to the relatives of people who have disappeared as a result of the conflict is an integral part of this action. Syrians have the right to know what happened to their missing relatives. Switzerland therefore encourages civil society as well as all states concerned to cooperate with the Independent Institution on Missing Persons, whose mandate is strictly humanitarian. We welcome the forthcoming appointment of a person to head this Geneva-based institution and hope that it will soon be fully operational. Respect for international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law, is fundamental if we are to halt the spiral of violence of recent weeks, which is of the utmost concern to us. Switzerland calls on all actors who have influence on the parties to the conflict to show the utmost restraint and to commit to a ceasefire throughout Syrian territory in accordance with Resolution 2254. We cannot repeat it often enough. The civilian population and the civilian infrastructure must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. We must at all costs prevent the conflict in the Middle East and neighboring Lebanon from spreading to Syria. To this end, we also are stressing the importance of an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon, given the worrying signs of escalation in the region, particularly in humanitarian terms. This is particularly the case in Lebanon, where the crisis has already caused more than 425,000 people to flee to Syria in less than a month, most of them women and children who have found refuge with relatives or in host communities. These people are in a situation of acute vulnerability and have immense and urgent needs. Women, particularly single women, are exposed to an increased risk of gender-based violence. In view of this situation, Switzerland welcomes the rapid action taken by the UN and international and national NGOs. We encourage them to continue their good coordination. As Ms. Jarbawi pointed out, the massive influx of people from Lebanon is putting a strain on the response to the humanitarian crisis in Syria itself, where more than 16 million people are already in need of assistance. To cope with the scale of the situation, all forms of aid delivery, including cross-border aid and aid delivered across the front lines, remains crucial. Greater predictability is also essential. This will only be possible if funding is adapted to meet needs. That is why a few days ago, the Swiss government announced its intention to allocate an additional 7 million Swiss francs in humanitarian aid to meet the needs of the population in Lebanon and Syria. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the regional turmoil must not divert our attention from the situation in Syria. This Council must remain seized of the matter and continue to work tirelessly for a lasting political solution in accordance with Resolution 2254. Switzerland will continue to engage to this end. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, for more than 7 decades, our region has been suffering from the Israeli occupation, the continued Israeli occupation of the Arab territories in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, and the systematic attacks, massacres, and crimes that occupation authorities have been persistently committing. Our region is also suffering from hostile policies pursued by Western countries supporting Israel at the expense of the security and stability of our countries and at the expense of the lives and well-being of our people. We must point out that a correct diagnosis is the first step to addressing any problem. Naturally, a wrong diagnosis and turning a blind eye to the essence of a problem leads to its aggravation, prolongation, and increased difficulty in resolving said problem. The Israeli occupation and the policies of the countries supporting it are the main reason for instability in our region. More than 7 decades of occupation were met with hundreds of meetings, initiatives, conferences, and the adoption of resolutions, all of which failed to find the solutions that the region needs. This begs the question, why? Because some states in this council have been doing their utmost to serve the Israeli occupation and to prolong it. They are harnessing their capabilities to cover up the massacres and the aggression by occupation authorities. They've even been engaging directly in targeting countries and peoples who are struggling to liberate their occupied lands and to restore their legitimate rights enshrined in international law and international resolutions. They've been working on destabilizing these countries, plundering their wealth, punishing their people. Madam President, the Israeli occupation continues to commit a genocide in Palestine, continues its wanton aggression against Lebanon, continues its repeated hysterical attacks against Syria. Every time the international public opinion thinks that it has witnessed the highest level of brutality and barbarism, the occupation authorities go further and escalate their barbaric methods, reassured that in this council there is a permanent member state that has chosen to stand on the wrong side of history and to prevent any serious and decisive action to stop the aggression, save lives, and alleviate the suffering. The unlimited and multifaceted support of the U.S. administration has enabled the occupation authorities to escalate their aggression and increase the frequency of their attacks on the territories of my country, Syria. Over the past few days, these attacks have targeted several residential buildings in the capital, Damascus, claiming the lives of innocent civilians and terrorizing peaceful citizens. On the 21st of October, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of the Syrian Arab Republic addressed a letter to the Secretary General of the United Nations, briefing him on the Israeli attacks, which have amounted to more than 116 since October 7th, 2023. These attacks have targeted with the most advanced and lethal types of weapons innocent civilians, including women and children. They have targeted production and service facilities, infrastructure, and even diplomatic premises and border crossings used daily by thousands of people coming from brotherly Lebanon. These assaults have resulted in the martyrdom of more than 100 people. They caused significant material losses and extensive damage to public and private property. My country, Syria, urges the Security Council to take immediate action and decisive measures to stop these attacks, hold Israel accountable for them, and ensure non-repetition of these attacks. But we do stress Syria's right to defend its people and land by all means provided for in international law. Madam President, the Syrian government continues to do its utmost to receive brotherly Lebanese citizens and Syrians returning from Lebanon, almost 500,000 to date. The government is providing them with all necessary services, despite the serious challenges Syria is facing due to terrorism, aggression, illegal foreign military presence, and its plundering of national wealth, and the inhumane unilateral coercive measures, which amount to collective punishment to Syrians. The Syrian government has taken all necessary measures to provide humanitarian assistance to all those arriving to its territories, whether Lebanese, Syrians, or third country nationals. These measures include facilitating their entry, establishing humanitarian response centers at border crossings in cooperation with the UNHCR, UN agencies, the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and Syrian civil society organizations. Additionally, the government has provided shelters, and Syrian families, Syrian citizens, have been hosting their brethren in different places. Healthcare, medical services, food baskets, humanitarian aid, transportation and communication services, and other essential services have been provided. Madam President, hundreds of thousands of Syrians have returned to their homeland, Syria. The Syrian government has facilitated their entry, regardless of how they left or what official documents they had with them. In cooperation with partners, primarily civil society organizations, the Syrian government has been offering healthcare and psychosocial support. Thousands of free legal services have also been provided to rectify the legal status of returnees and to replace lost documents and to ensure civil status information are properly recorded. In addition, fees exemptions have been granted and other facilitations and services have also been provided. The fact that the number of Syrians returning to their homeland has recently exceeded 300,000 unequivocally proves the falsity of Western claims regarding the issue of return. This confirms that the main obstacle limiting return rates is the deteriorating economic and living conditions and the lack of basic services, most notably electricity. As a result of the unilateral coercive measures targeting all Syrians, as a result of the politicization of humanitarian work, the withholding of funding, the reluctance to support sustainable solutions and reluctance to promote early recovery and livelihood projects, and the failure to fulfill the declared commitments. To date, the humanitarian response plan is funded at 26%, and we're nearing the end of the year. All these factors are in place, and then American occupation forces are plundering wheat, are plundering Syrian resources, are plundering Syrian wealth. Syria recently welcomed the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, who witnessed the great efforts made by the Syrian government to address the exacerbating humanitarian crisis caused by the Israeli aggression in Lebanon. He's witnessed the felicitations provided to returnees. My country rejects completely claims by some regarding return. My country looks forward to the response by UN member states to the appeals made by the representatives of the organization and its agencies to support our joint efforts as part of the humanitarian response. We thank countries that have sent assistance to Syria. Regarding what the American representative has stated, he expressed his concern over Syrians in Lebanon and the returnees. The solution is available if the US administration was honest, but it is not. The solution is for the US administration to stop its engagement in killing civilians in Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria, and to stop arming the Israeli killing machine, and enable the Security Council to fulfill its responsibility in maintaining international peace and security in the region. The US administration should have ended its illegal presence if it was really concerned over Syrians, and stop collective punishment targeting Syrians, and to stop plundering national resources. But, of course, the issues of human rights and international law, these are just ways for political manipulation and extortion used by US administration to target certain countries. We have seen how it silenced professors and students at US universities when they protest peacefully to demand a stop to the genocide in Palestine and to stop the crimes of the Israeli entity. When they demanded upholding international law that is taught at these different US universities. Day after day, we're witnessing how US representatives in this council and outside this council are competing to defend the genocide perpetrated by Israel and the horrific crimes and the targeting of civilian infrastructure, homes, peaceful civilians. All these horrific crimes are being defended. So he's not fooling anyone with the statement that has been just made by the US representative. Madam President, the terrorism that Syria has been facing remains a form of Israeli aggression against Syria and an extension of the terrorism inflicted upon the Palestinian people by the occupation authorities and settler gangs. In a familiar pattern, this is not new to us, the Israeli assaults on my country have been accompanied by a noticeable increase in the crimes and attacks of terrorist groups operating in the northwest of Syria, which are listed on your Council's sanctions list, along with their affiliated entities and groups. These attacks have targeted neighboring areas as well. My country, Syria, emphasizes its right and duty to eliminate terrorism and to dry up its sources. It holds the US administration and its allies fully responsible for investing in terrorism and using it as a tool to serve its interests and the interests of the Israeli occupation entity, and for the crimes committed by terrorist groups against Syrians, including women, girls, and children. My country warns that these policies and attempts to whitewash and polish the image of terrorist groups increase the risks of spreading extremist ideology and amplify the gravity of the threat posed by terrorism to the security and stability of Syria, the region, and the world. In conclusion, Madam President, my country remains committed to cooperating with the Special Envoy in a manner consistent with his mandate as facilitator of a Syrian-owned and Syrian-led process, and in full commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic. We look forward to the outcomes of his efforts to convene the 9th round of the meetings of the Constitutional Committee. And we look forward to his visit soon to Damascus. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
In the name of God, the compassionate and merciful, thank you, Madam President. We thank Mr. Peterson, the Special Envoy, and Ms. Osorno, the Director of the Operational and Advocacy Division, OCHA, for the briefing. We also listened to views expressed by other briefers. Respecting Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity is crucial to ensuring lasting peace and stability in Syria and the region, and must be fully upheld by all. The Syrian people have an unquestionable right to determine their own future and destiny, free from external interference. Madam President, the Syrian people continue to suffer unbearable hardship, from economic instability to foreign occupation and terrorism. The humanitarian situation remains dire, and Syria is in urgent need of external assistance, especially in light of the sharp reduction in donor contribution for UN program in the country and the recent influx of refugees from Lebanon. The UN humanitarian plan for Syria is only 26% funded, and the annual pledge made by donors are not being fulfilled. Despite the challenges the Syrian Arab Republic faces, including hostile policies from Western countries and unilateral coercive measures, the Syrian government continues to provide humanitarian assistance to those in need, particularly the influx of Lebanese refugees fleeing Israeli aggression. This commitment must be met with equal resolve from the international community to ensure aid is delivered impartiality and without political manipulation. We commend OCHA's effort and its partners, as well as the attempts and cooperation provided by the Syrian government to mobilize resources to support not only Syrians, but also Lebanese arriving from Lebanon. The international community must support Syrians' recovery efforts, including infrastructure rebuilding and sustainable development. Rebuilding Syria's critical infrastructure is key to its long-term stability. At the same time, the fight against terrorism must be continued in full respect of Syrian sovereignty. Eradicating terrorism is essential to restoring peace. Madam President, the path to sustainable normalization in Syria is an essential factor for peace and stability in the region. Yet this process is being obstructed by the destructive policies of Western states. The United States and its allies continue to pursue their failed policy of inhuman unilateral sanctions, effectively using them as a tool for the collective punishment of the Syrian people. They are also politicizing humanitarian aid and obstructing international efforts to support Syrians' reconstruction. Such harmful policies and practices have only prolonged the conflict and worsened the suffering of the Syrian people. Humanitarian assistance and reconstruction efforts should never be politicized or used as tools to pressure Syria. As we have said before, unilateral sanctions must be lifted, both as a legal obligation and a moral necessity, as these harmful and illegal measures only create unnecessary hardship and hinder Syria's recovery. On the political track, Iran remains committed to a political resolution of the situation in Syria and will continue supporting a truly Syrian-led, Syrian-owned, UN-facilitated political process. We continue to support the affairs of the United Nations and the Special Envoy, Mr. Peterson, for the political settlement of the Syrian crisis. Iran will spare no efforts to this end. We advocate the prompt resumption of the Constitutional Committee meeting as an effective mechanism to start the process. We hope that the agreeable venue for the committee meeting will be decided soon. We continue to believe that the Baghdad is the most suitable option. We trust that the UN Special Envoy will double his efforts to facilitate this process. Madam President, we strongly condemn Israeli continued act of aggression and brutal attack on Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity in blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter. Israel's occupying regime is deliberately pursuing a systematic policy to cripple the infrastructure of Syrian Arab Republic, exacerbating Syrian security challenges and undermining critical humanitarian efforts. As detailed in a letter dated 21 October 2024 from the Foreign Minister of the Syrian Arab Republic to the UN Secretary General, since 7 October last year, Israel has launched over 116 attacks on Syrian territory alongside its genocidal war in Gaza and occupied Palestinian territories. These terrorist attacks resulted in the death of over 100 civilians, including 12 children, and widespread destruction of schools, hospitals, airports, and other civilian infrastructure. Even refugees fleeing the violence have not been spared, with Israeli strikes targeting border crossing between Syria and Lebanon, intensifying the humanitarian crisis and endangering those seeking safety. These actions are flagrant violation of international law, demanding urgent accountability for Israeli ongoing aggression. The protection and support the regime receives from the United States emboldens its continued act of violence across the region, allowing it to act without consequence. No more than ever, this regime poses a grave and undeniable threat to international peace and security. Its relentless acts of terror are pushing the region to the brink of full-scale war. Israel's blatant disregard for all red lines is deeply concerning, as it shamelessly targets humanitarian convoys, facilities, and relief workers without restraint. On 9 October 2024, the regime deliberately destroyed a humanitarian aid facility established by Iranian Red Crescent Society, coordinated with Syria, and fully notified the ICRC. This facility, including a field hospital offering life-saving aid to displaced Lebanese civilians, was completely destroyed by Israeli airstrike. An intolerable and reckless assault on humanitarian affairs. Just yesterday, this regime, in its ongoing campaign of relentless terrorist attacks on civilians in Lebanon, assassinated Iranian doctor and relief worker Ali Haidari in Beirut. Dr. Haidari was providing critical medical care, treating the wounded, and assisting those in need of medical care. This heinous crime is a clear violation of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, which prohibit attacks on hospitals and medical personnel, constituting a war crime. In yet another outrageous act on October 19, the personal vehicle of an Iranian woman named Ma'soumeh Karbasi, along with her Lebanese husband, was struck by a missile fired from an Israeli drone in the densely populated area of Junia, Beirut, Lebanon. Immediately after the attack, they stopped the car and sought refuge at the side of the street and in an open parking lot nearby. At the moment, a second missile hit them, resulting in both of their martyrdom. This atrocity crime was captured on surveillance cameras and has since been broadcast across media outlets. In conclusion, Madam President, since the start of its genocidal campaign in Gaza and subsequent aggression against Lebanon, Israel has relentlessly targeted medical facilities and personnel, reducing hospitals to rubble, killing patients and wounded, and martyring hundreds of healthcare workers. This brutal assault on humanitarian services must not be unanswered, and the perpetrators must be held accountable. The international community stands united in its call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and Lebanon, and the Security Council must fulfill its responsibility. We once again urge the Council to take swift, decisive action to compel Israel to end its aggression and atrocity crime in Gaza, Lebanon, and Syria, and to ensure full compliance with international law and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. The time for action is now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. I am also grateful to Special Envoy Pedersen, Director Wosornu, Ms. Haji Ibrahim, and Ms. Jarbawi for their briefings. Unfortunately, the escalating violence in the Middle East remains a grave concern. The spillover from the conflict in Gaza into the broader region has gone from a risk to a harsh reality we are facing now. Israel's indiscriminate brutal attacks on Gaza and Lebanon are having severe repercussions for Syria and whole region, particularly impacting over 700,000 Syrian refugees in Lebanon. According to the UNHCR, approximately 425,000 people are estimated to have crossed from Lebanon into Syria since the escalation of hostilities. This mass influx, coupled with serious catastrophic humanitarian crisis, is straining the already fragile situation and exacerbating the pre-existing needs for humanitarian assistance. International community must not abandon the Syrian population, which continues to suffer from the absence of a political resolution. The funding shortfall for the UN's humanitarian response plan must be urgently addressed. Humanitarian aid, as well as early recovery initiatives, should be substantially increased. New dynamics on the ground require adjustments in both the budget and the delivery modality of humanitarian assistance. The deepening crisis in Syria poses significant risks to regional stability in an already volatile environment. It is essential that all parties exercise maximum restraint to prevent further escalation. Turkey will continue to facilitate cross-border humanitarian assistance in close cooperation with the UN, as we have done consistently to this day. Madam President, the 13-year conflict in Syria has inflicted immense sufferings on millions who endure restricted political freedoms, failing economy, mass displacement, terrorism, continually worsening humanitarian situation, in addition to the casualties of hundreds of thousands. We are closely monitoring recent developments in Idlib. Everybody should be careful. Preventing further escalation is imperative, and Turkey remains committed to contributing towards that goal. The resolution of the Syrian conflict can only be achieved through a holistic approach based on UN Security Council Resolution 2254. As we have stated before, a comprehensive settlement requires simultaneous progress across the following tracks. First, revitalization of the political process through convening the 9th round of the Constitutional Committee without delay. Second, creation of conditions for the safe, voluntary and dignified return of Syrian refugees. Third, preservation of Syria's territorial integrity and political unity alongside robust counter-terrorism efforts. Fourth, uninterrupted delivery of humanitarian aid into Syria. National reconciliation must also be an integral part of efforts to establish lasting peace in Syria. Progress in political process would also facilitate the steps to improve the living conditions of the Syrian people. Madam President, Turkey is fully committed to Syria's territorial integrity and unity. One of the most dangerous consequences of the Syrian conflict has been the presence of terrorist organizations exploiting the chaos to further their separatist ambitions. They are the biggest threat to Syria's territorial integrity. Madam President, I am grateful to Secretary General and all of you for expressing messages of solidarity with Turkey against this terrorist act in Ankara and messages of solidarity. To my knowledge, till now, all data validates that PKK planned and executed this attack against Turkish aviation industry, which serves not only to Turkey but friendly countries, especially in Africa, in other parts of the world, on their combat against terrorism. So we warned everybody repeatedly before about this organization and its separatist agenda and its actions before against civilians and with mass casualties. That's why in the next meeting, I hope all members will put the name of PKK and its offshoots SDF, YPG, PYD in their talking points when naming the terrorist organizations in Syria. Because many members name some terror organizations but exclude PKK and its offshoots deliberately. I thank again for the message of solidarity. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make another statement. You have the floor.
Madam President, I apologize for taking the floor, but I need to respond to a few things that were said by the representative of the Assad regime. He first pointed out that, or made the claim that the United States crushes expression, students who are trying to express their views on Gaza on college campuses. That's absolutely absurd. Freedom of speech is an important tenet in American life. It is enshrined in our Constitution. I would just ask one question of the regime's representative. Does the Assad regime allow students, Syrian students, political activists, members of civil society to protest freely? I think we know the answer to that. We've seen it over the years by the Assad regime. We saw it on full display during the Arab Spring and leading up to today. So I think the representative needs to think twice about bringing this issue about free speech before the Council, criticizing the United States when we know exactly what the regime does to Syrian citizens who don't agree with the regime and want to protest. One other point on this, we've made this point many times, and I think it's worth repeating again. The United States is not in Syria to plunder its resources. This is just a lie that the Syrian regime continues to propagate. We are there to fight ISIS. We have been very open about that, and so I just want to put that to rest, but I'm sure he will raise it once again. My last point, and this is to address the representative of Iran. Iran, of course, likes to paint itself as a victim of aggression everywhere in the world when we know through its proxies all around the world that it carries out terrorist attacks against innocent people, innocent civilians. Let's just look at what happened twice since April when the regime launched hundreds of missiles against the citizens of Israel. And had they not been intercepted, there would have been significant loss of life and major damage to civilian infrastructure. So I think it's important to keep, when you hear these comments, to put them in the appropriate context. Thank you, Madam President.
I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic who has asked for the floor to make another statement. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I did not have the intention to take the floor again, but what the representative of the U.S. administration said led me to ask for the floor again. I will be brief. Madam President, in every meeting, the representative of the U.S. administration tries to find false pretexts and allegations to justify the aggressive policy of his country against Syria. In every meeting, he repeats pretexts and claims that are baseless, and he starts giving us lectures and talking about human rights and other issues just to cover up the policies of his administration, which is now covering up the most heinous crimes committed by the Israeli occupation powers. Humanity has never witnessed similar crimes since the Second World War. His administration is not only covering up these crimes, it is directly engaging in them by sending the most lethal and destructive weapons and the most advanced technologies to kill, and they call those weapons smart. I do not see how. And they are also sending their defense systems to defend the occupier and to prolong its occupation of Arab territories in Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, and to embolden it to continue with its crimes. Madam President, tomorrow on the 24th of October, like tomorrow, the UN Charter entered into force. After relentless efforts to draft and adopt it, the Charter starts with a collective engagement to save future generations from the scourge of wars. During that stage and following decades of implementation of the Charter, the U.S. administration is today undermining this Charter. It is undermining the principles of the Charter and the foundations and pillars of our organization by obstructing the UN mechanisms, including the Security Council, to cover up Israel, and by paralyzing this organization and also obstructing the collective security system. These U.S. practices are clear to everyone, and the representative of the U.S. administration cannot deny them. This is testimony of the falsehood of their pretenses. Thank you, President.
The representative of Iran has asked for the floor. You have the floor.
Thank you. I want to emphasize that we never initiated attack on Israel regime. We solely responded to their aggressions according to international law. U.S. is the main supporter of this brutal regime, and without U.S. supportive action, Israel cannot continue this brutal aggressions and criminal act against the Palestinians and Lebanese and Syrians. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The representative of the United States has asked the floor to make a further statement. You have the floor, but before reopening the last round here, I will recall that this is a place of respect towards each other, and this is where we try to concentrate our statements, focus our statements to add something to the discussion. And with that, I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. I will be very brief. Let me just say that the Assad regime, based on its history, is in no position to criticize the United States, claiming that we are somehow violating the Charter. This is a regime that everyone must be reminded has used chemical weapons repeatedly against its own people. It is important that we not forget that and put that in the proper context. Thank you.
The representative of the Syrian Arab Republic has asked for the floor to make a further statement. You have the floor for a short statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I'll be very brief. The representative of the U.S. administration, which destroyed Raqqa under the excuse of combating terrorism, the whole city of Raqqa, killing tens of thousands of its residents, burying them in the rubble under the excuse of combating terrorism, is the one that supports terrorism, created terrorism, invested in it, and used it against Syrians to destabilize their country. Their presence is not there to combat terrorism because they simply can stop it if they wished. They are there to steal our oil, to steal our revenues, our national wealth, and this is not related to combating terrorism. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.